Our next rehearsal was with the intention of doing the big scene again so that we could solidify it, get it all blocked securely so they could start learning their lines with the set. However, we had a major setback because when doing this in a practical way with many other directors, you can only get a fixed time to use the set. So we'd booked out the set to do it then, but half of our cast didn't come in. We didn't have a Kathy, we didn't have a Jan, we didn't have a Mark or an Adam. We only had our Brian, our Phil, our Leah, and our Richard. So this made the group scene really difficult to do because we didn't have the characters we needed, so that we couldn't run it securely. We still wanted to go through the group scene because we needed to make sure we got the directions right for the people who were there. So we went through it really briefly because we wanted to utilise the set. We talked about where Phil would be. We placed him on this one of the centre risers, so he's just had his monologue with Leah in terms of the timeline that we're going to work through this monologue as well. And we ended up working through this monologue in this session, but we had it so that Phil moved along one space from when he was with the monologue, but he's still on the centre risers. We had the idea of Adam being under the riser, and the whole, well, not under it but below it, and the whole ideas that we had last time were basically visually shown, and we tried to explain to our cast where the others might be positioned and how we'd like it to look like a cluster, like not too much of a cluster, but like to show that they had a group connection, and also for the fact that when the monologue happens they'll all sort of lean in, and then there'll be this sense of like them finding what Adam is saying really unusual. Obviously we've not been able to practice any of Adam's monologue because we haven't had an Adam, and it's been difficult to do any of the Jan and Mark scenes or anything like that because of that. So as that terms of that setback, we tried to do those sort of bits. We tried to do elements of the later on in the big scene, with our first attempts at looking at the experiment between Phil and Brian when he uses a plastic bag to demonstrate like strangling him. So in terms of doing that, it was difficult. It was obviously a health and safety issue. We had to figure that out. We wanted it to be visually like extreme to an audience, but for it to be really easily like understandable so that people know why he's doing it and the intentions behind it, because Phil's intentions are that he's sort of exhibiting what he intends for Adam, so he's practicing it on Brian. Brian is totally oblivious to this, but then also this shows off to the audience his characteristic, that he doesn't know when to stop and no restraint. He doesn't really have that, and that he's really not what you expected him to be at the beginning of this, especially the play, but even in our section, the beginning of our section. So that's one thing that we definitely had to consider in terms of how he might like interact with Brian. We did it so that it was like he had all the control, he was calm, he had a really calming voice, and that helps anyway because Romario is like, his voice is like that, so it definitely adds to that element to the character, that he doesn't get stressed and he's like just really methodical about his thinking, which is almost like psychopathic and sinister. So when he goes to put the plastic bag over Adam's head, Brian's head, sorry, and he like, we potentially thought about walking behind, but they want it to be visual, so and easily be able to be seen, so maybe going up onto the riser, the set that we've already got, and we experimented about with that a lot as well. And then a lot of Leah's reactions to that, so her extreme build up, going from her like small pleads and her efforts to gain Phil's attention from the beginning and even through her monologue, to this extreme like Phil. We wanted her to build that up as an actress, to be able to build it from her efforts before to actually like an extreme reaction because they're about to commit a crime, they're about to kill someone. So his intentions are there. But having said that, the main thing that we did focus on in this rehearsal was Leah's monologue and Richard's monologue. We'd already decided that I was going to focus on Richard's and that Hannah was going to focus on Leah's in terms of the direction of their voice, their intonation, and some of their physical actions. So their intentions would both be there and we could compare and contrast them. So I'm going to talk more about probably Richard's in terms of what we looked through with what I looked through with Joe, and then I'll talk a little bit about what Hannah did with Vicky, and how we sort of edited each other's basically. So when looking through it with Joe, the whole idea was that Richard is a character with lots of energy. That was the effect that we got. Richard's character changes a lot. He has a massive character arc, and it's almost like all of this that's happened has a really calming effect on him. He starts off being quite an aggressive character, quite a confrontational character, and he develops to this sort of one who's kind of friendly with Phil and who's kind of bringing the group back together and it's all going to be all right, and he's quite optimistic, he's quite floaty, he's quite a bubbly person, and he doesn't also get involved in any of the group scenes. So it was definitely an aspect in which we needed to show his character more through the end monologue as a way of showing his development, especially consecutively when we're going to show the three performances together of the three sections in order. So when first going through it, we read through it. We read through what the intentions he thought as well. He said he thought it'd be circling. He thought that Phil would be really static and that he would have a lot of movement around him, and we agreed to that. Because Hannah and Vicky were working on Leah's monologue on the set, we just used a chair and we more tried to sort of do it as if I was Phil and he was acting off me, and then I'd step out and watch him and try and get him to do more interactive stuff. I think he was quite reluctant at first to do the interaction, to do it as much with a higher energy level as we wanted, as I wanted, because I think he was a bit hesitant about like the script and the lines. Like he was reading off it a lot, obviously, because he doesn't know the lines yet, and he was really hesitant to like actually go for it, whereas I wanted him to have more energy than that. So it was like I would direct him to sort of I said, well, like, do we need more interaction between Phil and Richard, and he would be all for it, but then it was like that barrier. So I think in terms of the intentions, they might not be fully shown through what he was doing, and we'll have to definitely work on it and building that into his confidence as well. So in terms of what we got him to do, reading through the line, and then at certain aspects, certain points in what Richard is saying, because he talks about how beautiful it is up here, and it's almost like a distraction point. He talks about, don't you want to know what they're thinking, Phil, and aren't you bothered? And he's not getting any response from Phil because Phil is a total shut off from all of society now. I think he is starting to feel the guilt of what has happened, and it's sort of like he is just really creepy. Also, the audience is trying to figure out what he's thinking whilst all of this is going on. This Richard's attempt to beg him to come down, this blurt of information projected onto Phil, and Phil's reaction is really what gives such emphasis and contrast to what Richard is saying. Richard is almost, in terms of his characterization, this is important, but it's almost like he's doing this, and the most important thing is Phil's reactions, because Phil himself is being demonstrated as someone who has zero empathy at this point, and you're trying to figure out if he does or if he feels guilt or not, and I think that he would feel guilt. I think that the thing that has disrupted him more is that there is no Leah anymore, because Leah has gone because of the decision that he made, and I think he's starting to realise that, and he becomes like affected by it, that things aren't the way they were. And I think the really interesting thing to be thinking about in the audience's mind is what happens to Phil after all of this. And that's basically what it is. And you think, well, how long is he going to stay up there? And is he ever going to come back to the group? And there's all these questions arise in the audience's head and as us for directors. So it's really interesting to write that. Obviously, we didn't have Phil step in just yet because we were focusing on their actual dialogue themselves. We needed Phil something to act off, and if they hadn't even got the acting right on yet, then it would be really difficult for Phil to act off, for Mario's Phil to act off. Certain lines specifically, like when he's talking about Brian being on medication and the sort of things like that, Richard is really jokey about it. He talks about Danny hating being that he's a dentist, but then he does get a bit more serious, talking about how Kathy's running the show and she cut Fisher's finger off, and all to do with like the dynamic between her and Lou and how the group has changed so much. And it's almost like a round off for the audience and for the whole point of the play of DNA. And I think in terms of his intonation, he's really good with showing like this, trying to distract Phil with all this information. He's trying to keep him included, and Phil obviously doesn't care blatantly to the audience. He's not showing any interaction. Richard then starts talking about a big wind of fluff, and I think this is what shows off his characterization the most. We wanted him to have like more talking to the audience at this point, and that Phil's definitely not listening, and that he might feel really excited and he's amazed by this big wind of fluff. He starts talking about life on other planets and knowing that we're not alone, and like really interesting weird facts that people may not know. And in terms of what the importance of those is, we wanted the emphasis on those to be full of excitement and for him to come forward and tell that to the audience, because the whole idea of what he's saying is not anything to do with the context of what's happened in the play. It's to do with Richard's mind and how he's changed and what he thinks, and it takes you back to the basics of reality and how insignificant this event really has happened, but you know how insignificant it all is in terms of the grand scheme of the universe, and he's really like that. And I think it definitely puts things into perspective for an end off to the play, and that's why he's really valid, and it was really interesting to work through that with him. So yeah, in terms of direction point of view, we need to definitely put it to set to see what a scale and what emphasis we could put on him moving around, but we want that level of movement to contrast to Phil, where we definitely discuss that. We definitely discuss the emphasis of energy on his dialogue and energy in terms of his movement. Someone who can't sit still, and who's always sort of looking around trying to find things to distract himself and Phil with.